Three young women were driven to a desolate stretch of federal land and shot to death in the early morning darkness. The man who received the death penalty never pulled the trigger. Tamika Black, 19, Tanji Jackson, 21, Mishann Chinn, 23, three women with futures ahead of them, invited to a Maryland apartment by a man they thought they could trust. What started as a social evening would end with their bodies discovered on a roadside near the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. January 27, 1996. Just after 4 a.m., the sound of gunshots echoed across the empty landscape. But the finger that pulled the trigger belonged to Willis Mark Haynes. The man who orchestrated their deaths was Dustin Higgs. Haynes, the actual shooter, received life in prison. Higgs, who never fired a shot, got death. For 25 years, he would sit on federal death row, maintaining his innocence, writing letters, filing appeals, waiting. The case would expose uncomfortable questions about federal jurisdiction, about who deserves the ultimate punishment, and about the thin line between mastermind and accomplice. I'd like to say I am an innocent man. I did not order the murders. Higgs would declare in his final moments. 3 women dead. 2 men convicted, one facing execution, the other serving life. But which punishment fit the crime? And in a case where the triggerman lived while the orchestrator died, what does justice actually mean? The story of Dustin Higgs forces us to confront the darkest corners of both human nature and the American legal system. Black had dreams beyond her classroom aide position. Jackson was building her career in education, working with high school students who looked up to her. Chinn found purpose in music ministry, teaching children to find their voices through song. They were daughters, sisters, friends whose laughter filled rooms and whose absence would create voids that time could never heal. What started as a social evening would end with 3 families planning funerals instead of futures. The discovery of their bodies would launch a federal investigation that would span years, divide communities, and force the justice system to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person who pulls the trigger isn't the one who pays the ultimate price. But on that January night, as the 3 women prepared for what they thought would be a casual evening with friends, they had no way of knowing they were walking into a trap that would claim their lives and change the course of American death penalty jurisprudence. Friday evening, January 26, 1996. Higgs, Willis Haynes, and Victor Gloria drove from Higgs's apartment at 13801, Briarwood Drive in Laurel, Maryland, to Washington, D.C., to pick up Tanji Jackson, Tamika Black, and Mishann Chinn. What began as planned social evening would spiral into a nightmare that would haunt 2 families forever. Higgs knew Jackson, and they had arranged dates for Haynes with the other women. It was supposed to be simple. 6 young people, a night out, maybe some dancing, some drinks, some conversation. The kind of evening that creates memories, not headlines. The 3 women climbed into the car, trusting, laughing, unaware that they were riding toward their deaths. Trust is a fragile thing. It can be built over years and shattered in seconds. According to prosecutors, Higgs made advances on Jackson who rebuffed him. The rejection cut deep, deeper than it should have for a man who was already married with a child. By 1996, he was married and had a son. But rejection has a way of transforming ordinary men into monsters. The evening progressed. Alcohol flowed. Inhibitions lowered. But something else was building in the Maryland apartment, a tension that would soon explode into violence. After a night of partying, an argument ensued, and the women left the apartment. They wanted to go home. They wanted to escape whatever uncomfortable dynamic had developed. They wanted to live, but Higgs had other plans. The women made it to the street. They thought they were safe. They thought the night was over. But as they waited for their ride, Higgs, Haynes, and Gloria appeared. There was a confrontation. Harsh words. Threats. The difference between going home and never seeing home again can be measured in heartbeats. Dustin John Higgs kidnapped and murdered 3 women that night. Though the actual mechanics of how a social evening became a triple homicide would only emerge through witness testimony and forensic evidence. The day planner found at the scene with Higgs's nickname and phone number will become a crucial piece of evidence, a tangible link between the victims and their killer. What happened in those final hours? What words were spoken? What promises were made? What threats were uttered? The three women were forced back into the car. This time, they weren't laughing. This time, they knew something was terribly wrong. This time, they were passengers on a journey toward death. As the car pulled away from the lights of the apartment complex and headed toward the darkness of the Federal Wildlife Refuge, three young lives hung in the balance. And in the driver's seat, a man who couldn't handle rejection was about to prove that wounded pride could be more dangerous than any weapon. Early in the morning on January 27, 1996, Dustin John Higgs and Victor Gloria waited in the car while Willis Mark Haynes shot and killed Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn. The murders occurred near the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center on the Patuxent Research Refuge in Maryland. The Wildlife Refuge, a place meant to protect life, had become a killing ground. 3 women, 3 gunshots, 3 futures extinguished in the pre-dawn darkness. The medical examiner's report would later reveal the clinical details of how 3 lives ended in violence. Jackson and Black had each been shot once in the chest and once in the back. Chinn had been shot once in the back of the head. Each bullet told a story of terror. Each wound revealed the final moments of young women who fought to survive. The chest shots came first. Jackson and Black faced their killer, seeing death approach. Did they plead for their lives? Did they think about their families? Did they pray? The back shots came as they turned to run. Hope transformed into desperation, survival instinct overriding everything else. But there was nowhere to run in the darkness of the Federal Refuge. Chinn's wound was different. A single shot to the back of the head, execution style, clinical, final. 3 different wounds, 3 different final moments, 3 different ways to die. The location wasn't random. The Patuxent Research Refuge sprawled across thousands of acres of federal land in Prince George's County, Maryland. Remote, isolated, a place where screams couldn't be heard and bodies might not be found for days. But this wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. This was calculated, planned, executed with the precision of men who had thought about how to kill and get away with it. Higgs and Victor Gloria waited in the car while Willis Mark Haynes shot and killed the 3 women. What convinced a 22-year-old man to pull the trigger 3 times? The crime scene would later reveal additional horrors. Blood spatter patterns that told the story of where each woman fell. Bullet trajectories that revealed the sequence of the murders. Physical evidence that would connect the killers to their victims. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was what wasn't found at the scene. No signs of remorse. No indication that the killers hesitated. No evidence that they tried to help their victims survive. The capacity for evil sometimes reveals itself in the absence of humanity. When the gunshots echoed across the Federal Refuge, 3 families lost daughters. 3 communities lost promising young women. And the American justice system gained a case that would test the limits of federal death penalty law. As dawn broke over the Wildlife Refuge, the bodies of Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn lay still in the January cold. Their killers had driven away, thinking they had committed the perfect crime. They were wrong. Although Higgs was almost immediately a suspect, the investigation into murders continued for nearly 3 years before an arrest was made. 3 years of painstaking detective work. 3 years of following leads that led nowhere. 3 years of families demanding answers. Justice delayed is justice denied, but sometimes justice requires patience. The day planner found at the scene provided the first crucial break. Jackson's handwriting, Higgs's nickname, his phone number, a direct connection between victim and killer that couldn't be explained away. But physical evidence was just the beginning. Investigators had to reconstruct the relationships between the 6 people who were together that night. They had to understand the social dynamics that led to murder. They had to build a case that would convince a jury to impose the ultimate penalty. Higgs knew Jackson, and they had arranged dates for Haynes with the other women. The social connections were established. The motive was clear. The evidence was mounting. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that painted Higgs as a man who couldn't handle rejection. Witnesses came forward with stories of his possessiveness, his anger, his threats. The difference between a difficult personality and a killer can be measured in degrees of violence. Haynes admitted to his role in the murders in a statement to investigators from the FBI and local police. The confession provided the final piece of the puzzle, but it also created a new problem for prosecutors. If Haynes admitted to pulling the trigger, how could they prove that Higgs deserved to die while Haynes deserved to live? How could they convince a jury that the mastermind was more culpable than the executioner? The investigation that began with 3 bodies in a federal wildlife refuge would ultimately expose the complex relationships between accomplices, the legal distinctions between federal and state jurisdiction. The triggerman who shot the women at the direction of Higgs, Willis Mark Haynes, 22, was convicted in May of 3 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and firearms violations. That jury spared Haynes' life, and U.S. District Judge Peter J. Messitt sentenced Haynes to life plus 45 years. The irony was stark. The man who pulled the trigger would live. The man who gave the orders would die. American justice sometimes creates puzzles that challenge our understanding of proportional punishment. But Higgs, who never fired a shot, received the death penalty. The federal prosecutors had successfully argued that leadership in a criminal conspiracy warranted the ultimate penalty, even when that leadership didn't involve physically committing the murders. The trial exposed the legal reasoning behind federal death penalty cases. Because the murders occurred on federal land, the federal government had jurisdiction. Because the death penalty was available, prosecutors sought it. While the evidence from accomplice Willis Mark Haynes' trial may have cast more doubt on Haynes, the triggerman, who got life in prison, it would not have changed the outcome for Higgs. The appeals court would later determine that the evidence against Higgs was overwhelming. The sentencing phase revealed the human cost of the crimes. Family members testified about their loss. The victims' futures were described in heartbreaking detail. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had orchestrated 3 murders out of wounded pride and sexual rejection. The death penalty isn't just about punishment. It's about sending a message that some crimes are so heinous that the perpetrator forfeits their right to live. The defense argued for life imprisonment. They presented evidence of Higgs's troubled background. They emphasized that he hadn't pulled the trigger. They pleaded for mercy. The jury deliberated. They weighed the evidence. They considered the victims. They thought about justice. And they decided that Dustin Higgs should die. The sentence was imposed. The appeals would begin. And a 24-year-old man would start his journey toward the federal execution chamber. For nearly 25 years, Dustin Higgs sat on federal death row, exhausting every legal avenue. A quarter-century of appeals. A quarter-century of hope and despair. A quarter-century of waiting for the needle. Federal death row at USP Terre Haute, a place where time moves differently, where men measure their lives in legal briefs and court decisions, where hope is a dangerous luxury and despair is a constant companion. The death penalty isn't just about the moment of execution. It's about the years of psychological torture that preceded. Higgs maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. Letters to journalists, interviews with advocates, statements to anyone who would listen. "I didn't kill anyone," he would insist. "I wasn't even armed." But the legal system had spoken. The evidence was overwhelming. The appeals were denied. The execution date was set. Dustin Higgs became the 13th and likely final person put to death by the Trump administration since it restarted federal executions. The timing was controversial. The presidential transition was underway. A new administration was preparing to take office, and the federal government was rushing to execute as many death row inmates as possible. January 15th, 2021, the final appeal was denied. The execution was scheduled for the following day. After 25 years, Dustin Higgs would finally face the consequences of his crimes. The machinery of death moves slowly, but it moves inevitably. Higgs' execution went forward despite his attorney, Sean Nolan's appeal to delay the proceeding because of Higgs' COVID-19 diagnosis. Even a pandemic couldn't stop the final act of justice. The execution chamber at USP Terre Haute, a sterile room where the federal government carries out its ultimate punishment. Witnesses separated by glass, media representatives taking notes, family members saying goodbye, the final meal, the final statement, the final breath. At 1:23 a.m. on January 16th, 2021, Dustin Higgs was pronounced dead. Higgs, who maintained that he was innocent, has become the 13th federal inmate to be executed under Donald Trump's presidency. His final words echo to the execution chamber. "I'd like to say I am an innocent man. I did not order the murders." Whether those words were true or false, they represented the final chapter in a case that had consumed 25 years of American justice. 3 women were dead. 2 men were imprisoned. 1 man was executed. And the questions about justice, proportionality, and redemption remained unanswered. In the end, the death penalty doesn't provide answers. It only provides finality. The families of Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn could finally close a chapter that had defined their lives for 25 years. The execution of Dustin Higgs brought a form of justice, but could never bring back the 3 young women whose lives were cut short on a January night in 1996. The case would become a footnote in American legal history.